Welcome to Nurses with Voices, the podcast where we amplify the voices of nurses everywhere. I'm your host, Dr. Lendra James, DNP RN, and I am thrilled to go on this podcast journey with you. Through this podcast, we aim to educate, empower, and inspire nurses at every stage of their careers. Whether you're a novice nurse navigating the challenges of bedside care, an experienced clinician looking to advance in your field, or dreaming of becoming a nurse entrepreneur, Nurses with Voices is here for you. Together, we'll explore the triumphs, struggles, and countless opportunities that come with being a nurse. So tune in, subscribe, and let your voice be heard, because here at Nurses with Voices, every nurse has a story worth sharing, and every nurse voice deserves to be amplified. Welcome back to another episode of Nurses with Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Lendra James, DNP RN, and today I have Dawn Morris here, and I'm going to let Dawn introduce herself. But before she does, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, and who's listening, I just want to give a brief reminder about what Nurses with Voices is all about. Our mission is to really help nurses escape burnout, have a voice, and achieve overall wealth, right? And both in their personal and their professional lives. And today we're diving deep into the topic, a topic that can significantly impact your career, your well-being, and understanding the legal aspects or legal landscape of nursing, right? And to help with this, I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest. Not only is she a seasoned nurse, but she is also an accomplished attorney specializing in law and healthcare law, right, Dawn? So yes. Without further ado, I'm going to let Dawn go ahead and introduce herself. She brings a very unique blend of clinical experience and legal expertise to our discussion. So, Dawn, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself and let the audience know how you got into, how you went from being a nurse to an attorney and an attorney to nursing. Let's talk a little bit about that.
I've had a very circular professional path. So I graduated from a diploma program way back in 1988 and practiced as a nurse for about 10 years, mostly in pediatrics and NICU with the little bitty babies. And as I was moving forward in my career, we're still in the 90s at this time. I thought that I needed to kind of spread my wings a bit. So I made the decision to go to law school. I graduated law school in 2000 and practiced for 20 years as an insurance defense attorney, not healthcare law specifically, but a litigation attorney usually for employers. And I handled all kinds of claims, including employment-related claims. But I always kept my nursing license active. I always knew that someday I was going to circle back to my original career. But after being away from the bedside for 20 years, I thought that nurse education would be a good fit between my first 10 years as a nurse and then my 20 years in legal practice. So for the last 5 years, I've been a nurse educator in a couple of different nursing programs here in Louisiana.
Awesome. So tell me, in your legal practice, what specific, or could you share some examples, I should say, of the type of cases that you encountered related to nursing or in healthcare in your legal practice as an attorney?
These aren't specific to nurses, but to employees. I did represent a large education system in my hometown, and there were many claims where employees, teachers, or support staff made claims against the employer for employment discrimination related claims. And that's really what raised my interest in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in more detail later. And a lot of times these kind of claims did not involve just one obvious event, but involved small incidences from multiple people that grew to the extent that it made it very difficult for the individual to work. And often they would quit, but we would call that a constructive termination. because they felt like they had no other option. They had reported the incidences to their supervisors. It was perhaps swept under the rug or not addressed in a way that really solved the issues. And that happens, I think. I see the link, though I have not had any cases or represented nurses related to this. I can very easily see the link between nursing research on incivility, especially between nurses, and the types of claims that I saw under Title VII and discrimination claims. And I'm not sure that we do a good job in education programs and really helping student nurses or new graduate nurses or even experienced nurses understand that link between what they may be doing or how they may be treating another colleague and how that might impact their license.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Title VII for those who are not familiar? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are not.
Yeah. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the statute or the federal legislation that prohibits discrimination against specific protected classes of individual. And we're familiar with these general terms. You cannot discriminate against someone based on their race, their color, national origin, sex, genetic information. But what's important to know is that many of these generic terms are much broader in scope. If you look at the EEOC website, which is the kind of enforcement body for Title VII, they handle discrimination claims before they get into litigation. So, for example, race does include what we expect it to include, but it may also include harassment or discrimination against someone who's married or involved with someone of a different race. So discrimination against that person because of who they're involved with may fall under Title VII. Sex refers to our typical gender-related male-female gender, but it also includes pregnancy-related employment issues and gender identity. So there's a huge scope of individuals who fall under those categories. Interestingly, under national origin or color, you can violate Title VII by harassing or discriminating against someone because you believe they are of a different national origin, even if they are not. So those very generic categories of protected individuals is much, much broader than people realize. Disability falls under this category as well. And if you kind of dive into the American with Disabilities Act, disability is defined extremely broadly. And it does not include only physical disabilities, but also medical conditions, psychological, mental health issues as well. So again, it's very, very broad. And I believe that more people fall into these protected classes than most people realize. So that's who Title VII protects. Now, for those individuals who are not a protected class under Title VII, there are still many ways for you to be protected by Title VII. If you are, well, let me kind of back up on that. If you're not a protected class under Title VII, it doesn't mean that you can be harassed indiscriminately when you're working. There are other provisions. There may be other federal provisions that will protect you, but certainly state law has multiple. I'm sorry, I just lost my words. State law is going to have multiple provisions that will protect employees as well, even if they're not a member of a protected class. And a lot of this stems from behaviors between colleagues. And it can also come from patients against nurses, family members against nurses. But what I'm looking at specifically and talking about today is that incivility that occurs between nurses. And again, it can be floor nurses who work on the same unit together. It can be charge nurse against the bedside nurses, supervisors. It can also occur in nurse education, student to faculty, faculty to student, faculty to faculty. It's a very pervasive problem within the nursing profession. And we call it incivility. That's the word that's used, I think, most commonly in nursing research. But I think that really soft pedals the extent of the issue because it's a nice soft word that flows easily off of our tongue. So it kind of downplays the seriousness, I think, of the problem. There are other words in nursing research that we do see, but we see this more in regulations. But bullying, microaggressions, workplace violence, and those are words that are specifically defined. And then that kind of get us to where I think Title VII fits in, which is under the creation of a hostile work environment against those individuals who are protected under the definitions that EEOC has established. So it's a very extensive area, but I think that we really shortchange, again, our nursing students and our nursing programs when we're educating them about law and ethics by not really disclosing or being transparent and how their actions, not the provision of nursing care to patients necessarily, but how they're interacting with those individuals that they work with on a day-to-day basis. And we know nursing, especially bedside nursing, is incredibly stressful, which I think just aggravates the entire situation. So I just gave you a lot of information there. So I don't know which way you want to go from that.
No, you're saying all good things, and interestingly enough, it's things that's so true. I mean, to your point, you can call it incivility, but to your point, it's nurse bullying. It's nursing eating their young, right? Remember that saying that
absolutely,
that it's just said throughout the country, nurses eat their young, and
right.
You're finding that a lot of times with this new generation, they're fighting back, right?
Yes.
So now it's just becoming a workplace, an environment that's completely toxic, and that's not what we want, right? We want to be able to nurture our nurses, whether they're new nurses, whether they're senior nurses. We want to be able to nurture our nurses, but we have to actually nurture one another as colleagues.
Absolutely.
Whether we're minorities, whatever our sexual preference is, none of these things should matter. And unfortunately, even though it's 2024, it does, and it still happens, and it still occurs.
And interestingly, what you just said is an ethical obligation under the Nurses Code of Ethics. It's the first provision, talks about the respect and dignity that you must show to everyone, not just to patients. And it specifically in the interpretive statements will talk about how that applies not only to your relationship with your patients, but also your relationship with your colleagues, and that it's incumbent upon you as an individual nurse to work towards creating, it doesn't use the word inclusive, but an inclusive environment or a nurturing environment to work in, because we know that it can be very difficult to really give safe patient care when we don't trust or have some negative feelings, I guess, about our colleagues. If we don't know that we can call this individual to come help us when our patient is crashing, then it really undercuts that confidence that we have in the way we perform our job.
Absolutely. I can remember, as a nurse leader, and one of the units that I had oversight of, and these nurses worked so well together. I mean, and to your point, you can see the difference. It made a difference in our quality scores. It made a difference in our patient experience scores. It made such a difference because they knew they had each other's back. And it does make a difference. I can remember even going back to my early days as a nurse, I'm still friends with a lot of those nurses because we had each other's back, and we grew up in nursing together. So nurse bullying is such a serious thing, and it's a topic that really does need to be discussed. And I'm interested in knowing if you could share some of the common manifestations of nurse bullying that maybe you've encountered in your career, maybe not personally, but something that you witnessed or someone else experienced.
Well, and through my reading up on the topic as well, if you really get familiar with how the EEOC website works, you can actually pull up complaints and decisions that the EEOC made, and a lot of them will describe the events that led to their decision that there was discrimination or a hostile work environment. So interestingly, when I was reviewing my notes for today, I saw a phrase and I wrote it down because I wanted to delve into it more. But it was workplace mobbing, which I think is a really good description of what I think happens in some nursing units. And we hear, the culture of nursing, and some units just have a negative culture for some individuals. So nurse mobbing is, what would be another word we might use? Like cliques. You have a clique of nurses, so they kind of band together and they treat other nurses or nurses who are floated to your floor or nurses who are different, who may be a member of a protected class, travel nurses. They may treat them differently as sort of a group mentality. And so some of the interesting behaviors, and some of these I found on different cases under the EEOC, but gossiping about others, spreading rumors. So a lot of these are small actions, and these actions by themselves would not be enough to create the kind of hostile work environment that Title VII looks at. But when it goes on and on and on for days or weeks or months, and you add it up to all the other small behaviors, it very easily creates that hostile work environment, right? So you've got gossip, you got drama, demeaning comments, so comments about, those old nurses don't know how to do this, or they can't do that skill, or, she needs to retire, that's age related, right? Or new nurses who haven't really had proper mentoring, or it takes them a little bit longer to become comfortable with a skill, but making those demeaning comments at the nurses station, right? Pettiness, rudeness. I think one of the biggest areas, or one of the biggest behaviors we see on a nursing unit is giving a particular nurse the worst assignment, the most difficult patients, the most undesirable patients, the rooms at the very end of the hall, right? The ones that are the most inconvenient, and doing it fairly consistently while giving your friends or your pals or your closer colleagues the easier assignments and ones with fewer meds to administer, right? So that's a little more subtle, and you have to really pay attention. Excluding, and this can be related to exclusion from opportunities within a healthcare facility to get more continuing education, maybe to participate in activities that help you with your career ladder. But it can also be social activities. So you have a baby shower for one of your colleagues and you invite everybody except these people, right? So even social events, maybe posting social events, everybody on the unit went bowling, and you look up and say, well, I didn't know about the bowling, right? So those are all small things. Sabotage, infighting, broken confidences, gaslighting, and this is a big issue as well. Go ahead and do that procedure, and I'll make sure the charge nurse knows that we talked about it. And then the charge nurse comes in and says, why did you do that? And this person who had your back knows nothing about it now, right? So gaslighting, kind of throwing you under the rug for events. So there's a lot of these, and you can see that these are, we can see these activities almost in any kind of social gathering, right? But it's sort of that mob or group think. And I guess we're talking about actual actions and behaviors, but those individuals who are aware of this happening and they don't do anything are also contributing to that hostile work environment. And it kind of gets to that slogan, see something, say something. And I get back again to under your code of ethics, but also under many state nurse practice acts, there is an obligation to report behaviors that don't comport with the Nurse Practice Act, and that includes professionalism, right? So to me, in some circumstances, your failure to report serious behaviors or a cluster of behaviors could potentially have somebody make a complaint against your license to the nursing board, right? So you didn't participate, but you did nothing, right? Or if the supervisor came and said, did you ever witness any of this? And you say, I stay out of it, right? All of those inactions could equally build or contribute to that hostile work environment.
Can you talk a little bit about and explain? And I don't want to say it incorrectly because I think you just touched on it a little bit when you mentioned how if someone, I'm just a bystander and I'm not saying anything about it, I'm staying out of it, and that person actions can be brought up against that license. You did a presentation about, or again, correct me if I'm wrong, about nurses being able to, take action against other nurses because of bullying.
Well,
Can you
sure.
elaborate on that a little bit?
So there's a couple of different actions, I think, and I'm going to preface that with my view on nurse education and law and ethics, right? So usually what we see as a nurse in nursing school or in any healthcare provision is they'll have a class and they might call it professionalism, or it might actually be an ethics class. But what they really focus on is teaching students about malpractice, right? And of course, we want to follow our standards of practice and have the skills and the competency to take care of our patients, right? So it is an issue. And then they'll talk about ethics, but in a very generic sense. They want to teach those four main principles: beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy. But in my view, that's where most programs stop. And I think they put way too much focus on potential malpractice claims because, yes, nurses can make mistakes, as can any other licensed professional, and they are at risk for malpractice. But I think that the risk of being sued for malpractice is going to be less than having somebody make a complaint against you to your nursing board, right? And I always tell my students this, that anybody can make a claim against you to the nursing board or file a lawsuit against you for any reason at any time. It doesn't mean it's a good claim. But once the claim is made or the lawsuit is filed, you have an obligation to defend yourself, which means hiring an attorney, right? Getting representation, cooperating with the Board of Nursing or the investigation. So even if it turns out to be an invalid complaint, you're still brought into it, right? So I think that in nursing education, we would do better, I think, to spend a little bit more time talking about if a complaint is made against you and going through the disciplinary process, because nursing boards are there to protect the reputation of nursing as a whole. They're not the individual nurse's friend, right? They're there regulating the profession and making sure that the profession is presented to the public in a positive light. So I think that it's much, much more likely for nurses to be brought into the legal arena through a complaint made. And these complaints can be a simple he said, she said. I witnessed my colleague, nurse so-and-so, acting professionally and being rude to a patient, right? And then you get a letter in the mail saying there's been a complaint made against you that you were rude to a patient, and that violates the Nurse Practice Act. And then you're brought into that, right? So that's one area, and I think that we should spend more time focusing on that in our nursing education. I also think that we should spend more time going over the nurses' code of ethics, more specifically, rather than simply stating there is a nursing code of ethics, these are the main principles, but I think that we should spend more time looking at those interpretive statements and looking at real life examples. So that's kind of my preface to the question that you asked. So yes, anybody can make a complaint against your license. It can be a parent, it can be a patient, it can be a family member, it can be a colleague, right? In theory, they're supposed to be made in good faith, but that's not always how the world works. And he said, she said can be very, very difficult to prove. It's hard to disprove that you didn't say something unless you have a witness, right? And then we get into that potential gaslighting because people don't want to get involved. But I think that there is a potential for a colleague. Let's say you have a nurse who has been a victim or subject to some of this group think or workplace mobbing where they're given the worst assignments. Maybe it is a travel nurse. They're a member of a protected class, they're a member of the LGBT community, or their race, or national origin, or they're older, they're over 40, which, since I'm on the far side of 40, I think is quite young, but 40 is the cutoff age for age discrimination. Then they can file a complaint with the EEOC that I have been the subject of a hostile work environment based on my age, my pregnancy, whatever my special class is. And these are all the activities that have occurred. And I reported it to my charge nurse. They did nothing. I reported it to my nursing director. They told me that nothing was going on. I was being oversensitive, which is a common refrain, right? You're just sensitive. So I think that just adds, that's one more behavior, or a gaslighting behavior. And then if the EEOC is going to investigate, this is at the administrative level, and they're going to make a decision. We think it is discrimination. We don't think it's discrimination. And regardless of how they decide, that nurse can still go forward and file a federal lawsuit under Title VII. And many courts, traditionally, the burden of proving those cases has been very, very heavy on the affected employee. But courts have been whittling away and making that level of proof more accessible to the victim of the hostile work environment. Right. So, for example, the Federal Fifth Circuit, which is traditionally fairly conservative, recently ruled in a case that an employee did not have to prove that they were fired or demoted, which was a specific requirement previously, rather than simply subject to an offensive work environment based on a series of smaller behaviors. So that is the potential there, right? Now, typically these kind of claims would be against the facility, but they're going to name all the individuals as well. There is a recent nurse that I've heard of who has a currently pending federal lawsuit. She was African American. She was over the age of 40. She worked in a community where the race percentage was fairly low. And when you look at the list of her complaints, it was an ICU, but it had an annex. So she was often put in the annex by herself with no one else, although the policy said there should be 2 nurses there. She was specifically told she could not use the same locker room as her other white colleagues, specifically, right? So that's pretty blatant. Right. One of the charge nurses said, since you're so good at cleaning patient rooms, you can go home and clean my house, right? And then at one point, she was accused of stealing a credit card from a patient and buying a stethoscope. And this was after she had made complaints about her poor behavior at work. That turned out, once they investigated, it was not true at all, right? There's a lot of gossip about her, giving her the worst assignments. And then ultimately, she took care of a patient who was a DNR, was on a ventilator. The decision had been made to remove life support. And I believe it was a night shift. The respiratory therapist was at another patient bedside, could not physically walk over and turn the machine off. So the respiratory therapist said, just push that button, and she did, right? And so later, someone anonymously filed a complaint with the district attorney that she had killed the patient. Right. So she was charged with manslaughter through the DA's office. The charges were very quickly dropped, but there were a lot of headlines in her community about her, killing this patient. The doctor spoke up on her behalf, saying, no, the patient was a DNR. We had already talked to the family. The family had already said their goodbye. She did not kill the patient. The respiratory therapist spoke up on her behalf, but the headlines with her, and she's got a very unique name, damaged her reputation. And even now, she's been very unable to find a job to support herself, and she's been living on the largesse of many of her friends and colleagues since then. And she has a currently pending federal lawsuit against the facility, but also against individual nurses who took specific action against her. So it's very serious. It's also very psychologically draining on the victim's part.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? And This actually, this actually is very, very relatable for me. And when I hear this story, this is just heart-wrenching for me, because, and this is another reason why I mentor. I actually I've been subject to nurse bullying, and as a nurse leader, actually. And for me, and I'm talking, demeaning behavior, creating a hostile work environment, just the thing, you know, having nurses file false reports against me, and as a nurse leader, right? And for me, I took the high road, and I dealt with it, and I came out on top, right? And I say that because, I mean, I'm not going to get into the weeds of everything that I went through. However, knowing now, if I had put into action then, this is why I mentor. And this is why this topic of conversation was so important for me, for us to have and discuss on this podcast, because it really truly happens. And, my heart just goes out to the young lady who you were speaking to. So like, that's something that I would want to do a fundraiser for, right? I'm sure, and hopefully maybe someone has already maybe done a GoFundMe for her. But these
I
are the
believe
circumstances,
I
and
do
these
believe she
are
has some type of crowdfunding going on.
great. I would love to donate, and I would love to raise sponsor something and have another fundraiser for her, or some type of contribution, because this is the
Absolutely.
seriousness of it. This is truly, truly, truly the seriousness of this, of what can happen. And people don't, just from being mean or discriminatory, because
Exactly.
that's pretty much what it is. It's
Right.
discrimination, it's bullying, and it's just blatant being hateful and mean.
Right.
To do this to this is someone's livelihood.
It
And
is
this is
absolutely.
why bullying behavior, it should be unacceptable. I mean, in my situation, what ended up happening, it was my direct report, and she ended up being removed as my direct report. But to me, that wasn't enough. But in the eyes of the law at that time, from my understanding, it was, well, and this was from speaking with an attorney, well, they removed her from being my direct report.
Right.
So,
So they took action.
they took action. Exactly. However, the damage has been done by this point. But like I said, that is one of the contributing factors that has gone on to make me the person who I am today. And and it's made me a beast, right? And when I say beast, I mean it in a good way.
Right. An advocate, right? Yeah. Right.
I've gone on to be very successful. I've gone on to achieve my doctorate degree, to start businesses. And again, this is why it all comes back to mentoring others and really letting other nurses know, especially newer nurses, what's going on out there. So this topic today, I really, really thank you for your contributions. And I actually have another question for you, and just kind of segueing into, like I said, my transparency. How can nurse leaders effectively, I know we talked about what nurse educators can effectively do, but what do you think nurse leaders can do to really effectively address and prevent bullying behavior within their healthcare settings?
Right. So, most facilities do have an anti-harassment or anti-discrimination policy, because they're required to do that by federal regulations if they receive federal funds, right? And I'm not sure I know of any healthcare facility that does not receive some type of federal fund. But facilities are not necessarily great at enforcing those, right? And they may not have a good reporting policy, or they do. But what happens when you have a young employee come in and they go to HR perhaps, or to their director of their unit, and say, I wasn't invited to the baby shower. I keep getting the worst assignments. Nobody will talk to me when I'm on shift, right? What they should do, right, if they're following their policy and their reporting policy, is they should document it, and take it seriously and investigate it, right? So that it's documented. We want that paper trail. The facility wants the paper trail, because if a Title VII complaint is made, the facility is going to be responsible. But that's not what happens. A lot of times when that individual comes in, they are considered to be a troublemaker, right? Or overly sensitive. and it's not usually documented initially. The other thing that often happens is when an individual starts making complaints of this small series of small events occurring, then it seems that things get worse, right? That's when they do get the worst assignments, or they are not included in the continuing education, which then becomes retaliation for making a complaint under Title VII, right? So I think that, and I think I'm going to get to your question, but I'm going to kind of go down a winding path. So I think that if an individual nurse begins to believe they're being treated differently, they need to keep a diary where they're keeping dates and specific details. They need to be as factual and non-emotional about it as possible, and write down the names of individuals who may have witnessed it, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to do anything with it, but once that thought occurs in your head that I'm being treated differently, and I think it's because I'm gay, or because I'm Black, or because I'm a travel nurse who's older than 40, right? Any of those things, you want to start documenting that. You also want to make a report to your direct report supervisor. That's probably not going to be the charge nurse, because the charge nurse can be any floor nurse who just happens to be the most experienced that night. But you definitely want to take it to your director and then follow that chain of command. And even if you're being told you're being ridiculous, you're being sensitive, you want to have them put something in writing so that it's documented. And if they don't, then you make a note to yourself. And I always encourage individuals not just to do it in writing, but maybe to have an open note on your phone so that you can document it contemporaneously with the event. Because then if it's 3 years later, you pull it up and you can say, well, I met with so-and-so on this date, and here it is in my phone, and it's date stamped in my phone. I didn't change the date. It automatically is keeping that date for me, right? So all of those, I think, are very helpful if it comes down to, or if it reaches the point of getting into litigation. And everything that I'm saying as far as documenting and keeping notes is true, whether it falls under Title VII, or if it's a state law claim, or even if it's a complaint to the State Board of Nursing. We don't want to be paranoid, but at the same time, we want to protect our own mental health and our professional licenses by documenting facts and not emotions. And it can be difficult because it is very emotionally draining to separate out the emotions from the facts, right? But I think that that's crucial. And I guess to circle back to your original question, what can nurse leaders do? One is they need to make sure they're following their facility policies. So if there's a policy that says, if somebody comes and reports XYZ, these are the steps you need to take, you need to do that. It's important for individuals to know that they can go to HR regardless of what their nurse director says, right? Now, I've heard many cases there where HR says the same thing, and the case that I told you about, HR was just as involved in the hostile work environment and the retaliation once the nurse began making complaints. And in fact, the HR person would call the nurse director and disclose things that should have been kept confidential because of that communication between the nurse and HR. So it just kind of created an even bigger issue, right? And I don't know if this is true or not. I feel like maybe someone from HR is who called the DA to report the patient death, but that may not be correct. So it was just an incredibly bad situation for that individual. She's been very brave and taken it all the way through the legal process. And I'm not sure what the standing on that is right now. But I think that it's not uncommon for individuals to experience something similar on a smaller scale,
right?
And they're very stressful. But it's just, as an attorney, I'm going to say you need to follow your facility policy, document, even if it's just in your own diary. Be factual, right? It is very emotional, which is fine. Write it all down in your diary with all your emotion, but then have your second diary with just the facts.
Right.
And
No, I completely agree and understand what you mean about the documentation, because in my case, as a nurse leader, you keep a lot of documentation, and I started keeping documentation, like you
yes,
said, with my own situation, and being able to go back to those documents. And like you said, just the facts,
right,
right? And even, like I said, as a nurse leader with other situations, I had began to keep documentation with employees, everyday things. So when it came to my situation, I was like, you know what, I need to be documenting this, right?
right,
Because to your point, being able to pull emails, right?
right,
Being able to pull text messages,
right,
right?
right.
All of this stuff, it's all documentation.
And you bring up a good point. If an employee uses the facility-based email to send a message to HR, then they are let go because, and this is not uncommon either, that troublesome complaining employee is suddenly found to not meet their competency skills or something, and they're let go, right? So again, that kind of constructive or actual termination and retaliation. But if all of your communication is with your supervisor or HR through the facility email, you're not going to have access to that after you leave, right? So if you are, I would suggest, or what I would do is I would send that email through official means, but I would either BCC myself to my personal, as you want to always be aware of patient HIPAA rights, right? So you don't want to use patient names, or CC so they can see that you're sending a copy to yourself. And if it becomes necessary, you start using the read receipt functions. But you want to print that stuff and make sure that you have access to it in the event you no longer can. Right. So that's just important ways to protect yourself. Now, and you may be getting to this too, but I want to make sure I don't forget to say this. All right. And I'm going to preface this with saying I do not work for any insurance companies. Okay. But I often get a question from students, do I really need my own liability insurance, right? And, because they will be told that if there's a malpractice claim against you and you're at work, the hospital insurance and their hospital attorneys are going to defend you. And that may be true in that scenario. But if you have the kind of legal claim that I'm talking about, you're not going to be you're not going to be able to take advantage of the hospital's insurance. They're not going to cover you for a lawsuit against them, and they're not going to pay an attorney. But also, if somebody makes a complaint against you to the State Board of Nursing, whether it's a patient or a colleague, you've been rude to a patient, that facility insurance is not going to cover you for that. But your own liability policy will. And one of the benefits of having your own insurance policy is there's usually, almost always, that paragraph that says, we will provide a defense to you for claims that arise under the policy. And what that means is we will pay an attorney to represent you in this claim, right? And attorneys are very expensive, right? $200 an hour for legal work is kind of on the lower side of a legal budget. So we don't want to be paying that out of pocket. It grows very, very, very quickly. So yes, and as far as I know, liability insurance for nurses is very, very inexpensive overall. It is definitely worth the $10 or $20 a month to protect your license.
That's a piece of fun.
So,
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to make sure I had time to get that particular comment in, because it is so important. It really is.
It truly is. I have to say, Dawn, this has been such an enlightening session today. I truly enjoy and appreciate you coming on today and sharing all of
Absolutely.
your expertise and your insights. Please put in, send me the information, and I can put in the show notes, any of sponsor information for the young lady who was going through the terrible ordeal. And I'll post it in the show notes so that, if there's a link, I can post it so that people can make donations to her. One last question I do want to ask you, and it's about diversity and inclusions. And I want to know, what do you think, in what ways do you believe diversity and inclusion can positively impact our nursing practice and our patient outcomes?
Right. So, another big area of nursing research or healthcare research has to do with implicit bias. That we sometimes unconsciously treat people differently because of how they look or what their background is. And so I think that the move towards increasing diversity and inclusion initiatives and programs helps us become aware of those implicit biases that we all have, but just also kind of just makes us more aware of what other individuals who are different than us may be experiencing, right? I will never know what it's like to be an African-American female, ever, right? I can empathize with those who tell me what their experience is, but I will never know what it's really like. And so I think that it's important to have those initiatives and to expose students who may have grown up in a very homogenous type environment. They've always been to school with people who are mostly like them or from the same socioeconomic background. So I think that by expanding the way that people think about others can help them recognize when these types of incivil behaviors are occurring against somebody, and they can stand up and advocate for them. So, I mean, the more education, the more information that we have, the better prepared we are to protect ourselves and to perhaps step in, again, as advocates for our colleagues when it's necessary.
Right, right. I love that. And I think that's the motivation behind my book, Confessions of a Nurse Executive. It's really
Mhm.
to highlight what, bias can look like. And,
Mhm.
we say incivility, we say a lot of different terms, right? And when you look at bias, it's, to me, it all kind of flows
Mhm.
into, under the same umbrella of
Yes.
everything that we've talked
Oh,
about today.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so my book is, talking about being able to identify bias, and my next book is going to be about being able to overcome bias, right? And
Yes, that's
and it's
great.
it's really, really incorporating these ideas and these topics and these concepts into healthcare, and it's really, really, really important because because we want to avoid the instances
Mhm.
such as the one, the example that we use today, that which is just so unfortunate, and we want
Right.
to avoid that. Right. And
Yes,
and that's and
absolutely.
that's like one of the worst case scenarios, but we
Right.
still have the other the other
Right.
intricacies that are happening on the day to day on our ships right now, currently as we speak.
Yeah,
And
nursing
how
is so stressful. We don't need our colleagues to contribute to that stress, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We need a union. We need to be unionized. We need to, and when I say unionized, I mean a movement, right? I
Right.
mean the gathering, the collaboration.
Yeah,
Now more than ever, nurses really need to come together and nurture one another. So I
absolutely.
really, really, truly want to thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you for
on
having
today.
me.
This has been absolutely enlightening. And there you have it, guys. That is
Thank you.
Dawn Morris, attorney and nurse. So until next time, make sure you guys stay educated, stay empowered, and stay inspired.